The kitchen light was flickering again, casting an uneven glow over the room as I shuffled in after a long day. The smell of burnt toast hung in the air, leftover from whatever meal Zach had attempted before disappearing somewhere. My parents sat at the dining table, whispering. As soon as I entered, they fell silent. Long day, Mom asked, putting on her usual soft smile, but I could see the tightness in it. She looked tired, more tired than usual. Yeah, I replied, grabbing a glass of water and leaning against the counter. The sound of the faucet filled the room, masking the uncomfortable silence. I had to pick up an extra shift. The bills. But they weren't listening. They exchanged glances, and I noticed Dad fiddling with a piece of paper. Nora, he started, clearing his throat. We've been talking about Zach's wedding. It's coming up so fast. And you know how he struggled to get on his feet. I felt a knot in my stomach tighten. Zach had been struggling for years, hopping from job to job, relying on my parents to cover his mistakes, his debts, his messes. Yet somehow, he always landed on his feet. Right? I said slowly, trying to keep my voice even. So, what does that have to do with me? Another glance passed between them, like they were mentally passing a baton. Mom spoke next. Honey, we were thinking just for the wedding and maybe a little after, we need some extra funds. Just to make sure everything goes smoothly. It hit me right then. I knew where this was going. You're asking for my college fund, I said flatly, not even bothering to make it a question. I gripped the counter behind me, feeling my face flush. It's not asking, honey, Dad said quickly, trying to soften the blow. It's borrowing. Just borrowing. We'll pay you back once the restaurant picks up again. You know we've been struggling, too, and it would mean so much for Zach to start his life right. I wanted to laugh. Or scream. So, Zach's life, his wedding, is more important than my future? The words left my mouth before I could stop them, each one sharp with frustration. I'd worked so hard, saving every penny, sacrificing college for years to keep our family afloat, telling myself that someday it would be my turn. Now, they were pulling the rug out from under me. Nora, Mom said softly, reaching for my hand. You know how much we appreciate everything you do for this family. We thought you'd understand. Zach's had it rough. Rough. My voice came out louder than I intended. He's had everything handed to him. You've bailed him out of every mess, every mistake. And now you want me to do it again. Dad's face hardened, a flicker of defensiveness. This isn't about favoring anyone, Nora. It's about family. Sometimes family has to make sacrifices. And I'm the only one who ever does, I whispered, more to myself than to them. I pushed past the lump in my throat. What about me? What about my dreams? Mom sighed, looking away. Dad shook his head, looking tired. Dreams are important, Nora, he said in that low, steady voice that always tried to soothe things over. But family is more important. And right now, your brother needs us. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the growing ache in my chest. I wanted to argue, to fight back, to make them see how unfair this was. But looking at them, both worn out and pleading, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. To them, I was dependable, sturdy, always there to pick up the pieces. Zach was the fragile one, the one who needed protecting. Fine, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Do what you want. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, each step feeling heavier than the last. Upstairs, in my small, cramped room, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the blank wall in front of me. The walls felt like they were closing in, as if the whole house was pressing down, squeezing out any bit of hope or ambition I'd held onto. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept circling back to the same thoughts, the same frustrations. Every plan, every hope I'd nurtured over the years felt like it was slipping away, drowned out by Zach's endless needs. I'd worked so hard, given up so much. For what? So that he could have everything he wanted, while I was left to pick up the scraps. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. I went to work, kept up with my chores, avoided talking about the wedding or my college fund. I told myself it wasn't worth fighting, that arguing would just make things worse. But the resentment simmered, just below the surface, coloring everything in my life. One afternoon, while I was cleaning up after a particularly grueling shift at the restaurant, my boss, Mrs. Jensen, pulled me aside. "Nora," she said kindly, "I've been meaning to talk to you. I know you've been interested in art school, and I heard about a scholarship opportunity. They're looking for someone with your work ethic, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." The words hit me like a punch. For a brief, dizzying moment, hope flared in my chest. But then reality crashed down, cold and unrelenting. There was no money left for college. My future had been sacrificed for Zach's wedding. The thought left a bitter taste in my mouth. "Thank you, Mrs. Jensen," I said, forcing a smile. "But it's just not the right time." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Family stuff." She looked at me with something like pity in her eyes, nodding slowly. "Well, if things change, just know that I believe in you, Nora. You've got a real talent, and you deserve to follow that." Her words should have comforted me, but they only made the pain sharper. I wanted to scream, to tell her how unfair it all was, how I was trapped in a life I hadn't chosen. But I kept quiet because that's what I always did. At home, the wedding plans grew more chaotic, more extravagant. I watched as my parents poured every last cent into making Zach's day perfect, while I sat in the background, invisible, my own dreams gathering dust. I overheard Zach and his fiancée, Katie, joking about my silly art phase, mocking my dreams as if they were nothing more than childish fantasies. It was like salt in an open wound, a constant reminder of how little they valued me, how easily they dismissed my sacrifices. The night before the wedding, I came home to find my room rearranged. The small box I kept hidden under my bed, my emergency savings, was gone. Panic shot through me, and I tore through my things, searching every drawer, every nook. But it was gone. All of it. The money I'd scraped together, dollar by dollar, was gone. I confronted my parents, my voice shaking with anger. "Where is it? My savings? I need that money." Mom looked at me, eyes wide with feigned innocence. "We had to use it, Nora, for the wedding. You understand, don't you? This is an important moment for your brother." An important moment? I could barely keep my voice from cracking. "You had no right. That was my money." Dad stepped in, his face stern. "Nora, this isn't just about you. This is for the family. You're being selfish. Your brother deserves to start his life with everything he needs." My chest felt tight, every word stinging like a slap. Selfish. They were calling me selfish. After everything I'd given up, everything I'd done for this family. The words bubbled up, angry and raw. "No," I said, my voice cold. "You're the ones who are selfish. You've taken everything from me, for him. You've taken my future, my dreams. And you expect me to just accept it?" They looked at me, shocked, as if I'd suddenly transformed into a stranger. But I didn't care. The dam had finally broken, and I couldn't hold back the flood of anger and betrayal any longer. I left the house that night, wandering through the empty streets, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to that house, that life. Not anymore. In the quiet of the night, I made a decision. I was done sacrificing for people who didn't care, who would never see me for who I was. I walked into the wedding venue feeling like an outsider. The decorations were elaborate, each detail meticulously planned, and all for Zach. Everyone else was buzzing with excitement, floating in their own world, while I felt like a ghost, drifting through the crowd unseen. I tried to keep a polite smile on my face, blending into the background as best as I could. After all, today was about Zach, and I'd been told enough times that my feelings didn't matter here. As I wandered past the guests, I caught snippets of their conversations, voices lifted in admiration over how perfect everything looked. Perfect. That word felt hollow now. I'd given up everything to help create this picture of perfection, to help my family achieve this moment. But looking around, I realized just how little any of it meant to me. None of this felt like my life. I was just a supporting character in Zach's story, cast to the sidelines. In the corner of the room, I saw my parents laughing with Zach and his fiancée, Katie. They looked so happy, so proud. I wanted to feel that way too, to be happy for them, but all I felt was a deep, aching resentment. I was trying so hard to keep it together, to swallow the bitterness, but the more I saw of their happiness, the harder it became. After the ceremony, my parents gathered everyone for speeches. I stood in the back, not wanting to draw attention to myself, silently praying for this to be over. My father took the microphone first, his face beaming with pride as he praised Zach, listing all his achievements. It was surreal hearing him describe a version of Zach that didn't even exist. The hardworking son, the reliable man. They made him sound like he'd single handedly kept this family afloat, while I was just there. And then, as if reading my mind, Dad's tone shifted. He started to talk about sacrifices, about how family comes together during tough times. His gaze drifted toward me, lingering just long enough to make it clear he was talking about me. We've all had to make sacrifices, but that's what family is about, he said, his voice solemn, as if he was imparting some great wisdom. We're so grateful for the support we've had along the way. The crowd clapped, nodding, as if his words made perfect sense. But I felt my face flush, my stomach twisting. There it was again, the endless expectation that I would just keep giving, keep sacrificing for the sake of this family, for the sake of Zach. I clenched my fists, fighting to stay calm, to keep from storming out of the room. And then, to my horror, Katie took the microphone. She glanced around with a smirk, her eyes glinting with something cruel. I just want to thank everyone for coming and making today so special, she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Especially Nora, Zach's sister. She's been such a trooper, helping out wherever she can. She's so selfless, isn't she? She laughed, a shrill sound that cut through the room. I mean, who else would give up their future for a family wedding? Laughter rippled through the crowd, and I felt my heart plummet, my vision blurred, my pulse pounding in my ears. Katie had managed to turn my sacrifices, my dreams, into a joke, a punchline for everyone to laugh at. I felt humiliated, exposed, as if they'd all just witnessed my most private wounds and found them amusing. I forced myself to breathe, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the crushing humiliation. But Katie wasn't done. She leaned in, her voice lower now, just loud enough for those close by to hear. I mean, it's cute, really thinking art school would have worked out. But some people just aren't meant for big dreams, right? I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned and slipped out of the room, my body numb as I stumbled through the empty hallway. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away, away from their laughter, their judgment, their complete lack of understanding. I found myself outside, the cool night air washing over me like a balm. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume me. But the longer I stood there, the more the resentment burned, growing hotter and fiercer until it was all I could feel. All these years, I'd given everything I had to my family, and this was my reward. To be mocked, belittled, turned into a joke. I'd had enough. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the stars, grounding myself in the silence. But when I finally walked back inside, something had shifted. I felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying was suddenly gone. I was done being the sacrificial lamb, the one who was always there to pick up the pieces. If they wanted a family where Zach was the golden child, the one they favored, they could have it. I wasn't going to stand in the shadows anymore. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I avoided everyone, keeping to the edges of the room, lost in my own thoughts. Every glance, every overheard comment felt like a reminder of how little they understood me, how easily they dismissed my dreams and my sacrifices. By the time the wedding ended, I felt like a stranger in my own life. When I finally got home, I packed a small bag, grabbing the essentials. I didn't know where I'd go, but I couldn't stay here any longer. Not with them. Not after tonight. I left a note on the kitchen table, a simple goodbye that didn't explain much. I figured they wouldn't understand, even if I tried. The next morning, I caught a bus to a city miles away. As the buildings blurred past the window, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. This wasn't the life I'd planned for myself, but it was a life on my terms. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. In the weeks that followed, I worked odd jobs to make ends meet, saving up enough to rent a tiny apartment in a rough neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I started attending community art classes, pouring everything I had into my work, letting all the pain, anger, and frustration bleed onto the canvas. My art became an escape, a place where I could finally be myself, free from the weight of my family's expectations. The more I painted, the more I felt myself coming back to life. I discovered a community of artists who understood me in a way my family never had, people who saw my dreams as something real, something worth fighting for. They encouraged me, supported me, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged. Months turned into years, and I began to build a name for myself. My work was featured in a small gallery, and then another. People started recognizing my style, my voice. I even had a small but growing following, people who resonated with the stories my art told. Each success felt like a victory, a reminder that I'd made the right choice in leaving. But every now and then, late at night, I'd think about my family. I wondered if they'd ever realized what they'd done, if they'd ever felt even a fraction of the regret I'd carried for so long. Part of me wanted to reach out, to show them how far I'd come, to prove that I'd made something of myself despite everything. But another part of me knew better. I wasn't doing this for them. This was for me. I'd managed to carve out a life I was proud of, a life that was finally mine. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was moving towards something bigger, something brighter. It had been nearly 3 years since I left, and life had moved on. My life, at least. The little apartment in the city had become a sanctuary, a place filled with paint-splattered canvases and the smell of linseed oil. My art had become a way to heal, to work through all the anger and sadness that had once filled me. Slowly, steadily, I'd built something for myself, something real, something no one could take away. The past, with all its betrayals and sacrifices, had faded into something distant, like an old bruise that was no longer tender to the touch. Then, one morning, as I was preparing to deliver a new piece to the gallery, my phone rang. The number flashing on the screen was familiar, too familiar. My mother's name. For a moment, I just stared at it, feeling a rush of old emotions I thought I'd buried. I let it ring, but she called again and again, the sound persistent and demanding. Finally, with a deep breath, I picked up. "Hello." "Nora." My mother's voice was strained, barely more than a whisper. "Nora, we need you. It's the restaurant. Your father and I, oh, we don't know what to do." The mention of the restaurant sent a strange pang through me. Despite everything, I still held a soft spot for that place, for all the memories wrapped up in it. I could picture the worn countertops, the booths with peeling vinyl, and the old jukebox that had played hits from the 80s. But that place, like everything else, had been part of a world I'd left behind. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. "It's Zach," she said, and suddenly I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. He took some loans, Nora. Big ones. And he used the restaurant as collateral without telling us. Now they're saying we have a month to pay back thousands of dollars, or they're going to shut us down." I closed my eyes, rubbing a hand over my face. Of course it was Zach. Somehow it was always Zach. The golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And once again, here was my family asking me to step in, to clean up his mess, as if I hadn't already given enough. "You're asking me to come back," I said slowly, feeling the weight of her request settle over me. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking. "We don't have anyone else to turn to, Nora. Your father's health isn't what it used to be, and I can't keep up with everything. Please, just come back and help us sort this out." I felt a mix of anger and sadness twisting inside me, tightening like a knot. The nerve of them, after everything, to ask me to step back into that role again. It was as if nothing had changed, as if the years I'd spent away, the life I'd built, meant nothing. I wanted to say no, to tell her that it wasn't my problem anymore. But there was still a part of me that remembered late nights in that restaurant, helping Dad close up, sharing quiet moments that felt like they belonged to a different world. I don't know, I said finally, my voice trembling. I'll think about it. After hanging up, I sat in silence, my mind racing. Memories of my family, of the years spent cleaning up their messes, flickered through my thoughts like scenes from an old film. And with each memory came a wave of bitterness, a reminder of the sacrifices I'd made, sacrifices that had never been enough for them. I knew I shouldn't go back. I'd spent years putting myself back together, building a life free from their expectations. But the thought of losing the restaurant, of watching the place where so much of my childhood was rooted, filled me with a sadness I couldn't ignore. 2 days later, I found myself on a bus back to my hometown, my stomach a knot of anxiety. I told myself it would only be temporary, that I'd help them get things sorted out and then leave again. I'd set boundaries, make it clear that I wasn't going to stay. But as the familiar streets came into view, I felt that old pull, the mix of nostalgia and resentment that had kept me away for so long. When I arrived at the restaurant, it was empty, the lights dimmed. The place looked smaller than I remembered, as if the years had somehow shrunken it. My parents were behind the counter, and they looked up, their faces lighting up with a relief that made my chest ache. They looked older, more worn down, as if the weight of the past few years had finally caught up to them. "Nora," Mom said, rushing over to hug me. Her embrace was warm but hesitant, as if she was afraid I might pull away. I stiffened at first, but then I let myself sink into the hug, just for a moment. "Hey, Mom, Dad." My father gave me a nod, his expression unreadable. "Glad you're here, Nora." We didn't know what else to do. I could feel the tension already, the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. But I took a deep breath, reminding myself why I was here. "Let's get straight to the point," I said, pulling back from Mom's embrace. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, they filled me in on Zach's mess. Apparently, he'd gotten involved with some sketchy business ventures, promising high returns and easy money. When things went south, he'd used the restaurant as collateral without telling anyone, hoping to turn things around before anyone found out. But of course, it hadn't worked. Now the debts were piling up, and the creditors were threatening to take the restaurant. As they talked, I felt my anger simmering beneath the surface. Zach had always been reckless, but this was beyond anything I'd imagined. He hadn't just risked his own future. He'd gambled with everything my parents had worked for, everything I'd sacrificed for. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice cold. My parents exchanged a glance, their faces tight with worry. He's at home," Mom said softly. "He didn't want to come. He thought you might be upset with him." Upset? I let out a bitter laugh. That's putting it lightly. But I pushed the anger aside, focusing on what needed to be done. I spent the next few days meeting with creditors, trying to negotiate payment plans, assessing the restaurant's finances. It was grueling work, but I kept my focus, determined not to let Zach's mistakes drag us all down. My parents hovered nearby, watching me with a mixture of guilt and relief, their gratitude almost palpable. But beneath the surface, I could feel the resentment growing. Every time I caught a glimpse of my parents' relieved smiles, every time they thanked me for saving the family, it only reminded me of all the times they hadn't been there for me, all the times they'd chosen Zach over me. Finally, one evening, I decided to confront him. I showed up at my parents' house, and they let me in without a word. I found Zach in his old room, lying on his bed, scrolling through his phone as if nothing was wrong. When he saw me, he rolled his eyes, putting his phone down. "Here to lecture me?" The casual dismissal in his tone set something off in me. "Lecture you?" I snapped. "Do you even understand what you've done? You used Mom and Dad's livelihood, their whole future, as collateral. And now they're on the brink of losing everything because of you." He shrugged, his face a mask of indifference. It's not like they're actually going to lose it. You're here, aren't you? I stared at him, stunned. You think I'm just going to fix everything for you? That's what you do, isn't it? He said, smirking. You're the responsible one, the one who can't help but take care of everyone else's problems. I knew you'd come back. The arrogance in his voice, the complete lack of remorse, made me feel sick. All these years, I thought maybe he was just lost, misguided, a victim of our parents' favoritism. But now, seeing the way he looked at me, I realized he was perfectly aware of how he manipulated everyone around him. And he didn't care. You don't deserve them, I whispered, my voice thick with anger. You don't deserve anything they've given you. He shrugged again, unbothered. Maybe not, but that's not going to stop them from loving me more than you. You can clean up my mess, make the restaurant perfect again, but it'll never be enough, Nora. It's always going to be me they care about. I felt my hands trembling, the words hitting me like blows. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him understand how much he'd taken from me, how much he'd destroyed. But I knew it wouldn't matter. He'd never understand, and I was done wasting my energy on him. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my mind reeling. As I left the house, a strange calm settled over me. I'd done my part. I'd given them everything I could, but I couldn't keep giving, couldn't keep sacrificing for a family that would never see me for who I was. Back at the restaurant, I sat down with my parents and told them the truth. I've done all I can. The rest is up to you. They looked at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. But I held firm, knowing that this was the only way to finally break free. I returned to the city with a weight lifted off my shoulders, even though a new ache sat in my chest. I'd done everything I could, given them every opportunity to turn things around. But this time, I wasn't going to be the one carrying the burden. I was done playing the role of savior. I'd seen clearly how little my sacrifices meant to them, how Zach's mistakes were brushed aside like dust while mine were blown into mountains. Back in my small apartment, I let myself fall into the rhythm of life I'd built here. My days were filled with the steady hum of painting, attending gallery events, connecting with people who saw me for who I was. My name was finally gaining traction, and I could feel my career starting to take root in a way that felt real. My work resonated with people, and they connected to the rawness I poured onto each canvas, the pain, the anger, and the resilience that had been the foundation of my life. One evening, I was finishing up a painting when I received a message from the gallery. They wanted to feature me in a solo exhibition, the kind of opportunity I'd dreamed of for years. As I stared at the screen, the news felt surreal. This was it, a chance to prove, not only to the world, but to myself, that I'd made it. I'd built something real, something lasting. I was finally standing on my own 2 feet, and I didn't need my family's approval or their apologies to validate it. But even as I celebrated, there were moments, quiet ones, where the ghosts of the past crept in. Sometimes I'd wonder if they were managing without me, if they'd managed to keep the restaurant afloat, or if they were struggling. I hated that I still cared, but a part of me still felt that pull, that need to be there, even after everything they'd done. One weekend, after a particularly successful night at the gallery, I received a letter from home. It wasn't from my parents or Zach, but from an old neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, who had practically watched me grow up. Her handwriting was shaky, the words barely legible, but the message was clear. My father had been ill, and the restaurant had officially shut down. I read the letter over and over, a strange numbness filling me. The restaurant had been the heart of our family, the place where I'd spent so many years pouring out everything I had. And now it was gone. My father was sick, and they hadn't even told me. They hadn't reached out, hadn't asked for help, or even let me know what was happening. I wanted to be angry, but all I felt was a hollow sadness. Maybe this was what they wanted, to protect Zach from having to face reality by keeping me in the dark. But at that moment, I realized that I couldn't keep letting their decisions, their secrets, affect me. I'd left for a reason, and I wasn't going to let their silence drag me back into that cycle of pain. Instead, I channeled all of it into my art, pouring out everything, the love, the loss, the anger, be emptiness, onto canvas after canvas. My solo exhibition was drawing closer, and I wanted it to be my statement, my declaration of independence from the past. Each painting was like a letter I'd never send, a way to express everything I never had the chance to say. The night of the exhibition arrived, and the gallery was packed. People drifted from one painting to the next, murmuring softly, their expressions reflecting the emotions I'd hoped to evoke. I watched them, feeling a quiet pride swell within me. This was my life, my work, my story. I didn't need anyone's validation to know that I'd made something meaningful. But amidst the sea of faces, one caught my attention. Standing by the doorway was Zach. For a moment, I thought I was imagining him, that he was some figment of my past come to haunt me. But then he stepped forward, looking around the room with a mixture of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. I felt my heart race, a mixture of anger and confusion boiling up. He hadn't been part of my life for years, and I'd made peace with that. Seeing him here in my space felt like an intrusion. I wanted to ignore him, to pretend he wasn't there. But before I could slip away, he spotted me and made his way over. Nora, he said, a tentative smile on his face. This is incredible. I didn't know you'd come this far. I folded my arms, keeping my expression neutral. What are you doing here, Zach? He looked down, his smile fading. I heard about the exhibition, and I guess I wanted to see it for myself. To see what you've done. There was a pause, a heavy silence stretching between us. I could see the hint of something in his eyes, maybe regret, but it felt hollow. Too little and far too late. How did you even know about it? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Mom mentioned it, he said softly. She's been watching, following your career online. She's proud, you know. I almost laughed. Proud. The word felt foreign coming from him. Funny. She never reached out. None of you did. He winced, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of guilt. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Look, Nora, I know I messed up. I've spent years trying to figure out how to fix things, how to make it right. But every time I tried, it felt like I was only making things worse. I studied him, trying to gauge the sincerity in his words. Part of me wanted to believe him, to let go of the bitterness and find some semblance of closure. But the wounds ran deep, and I wasn't ready to let go so easily. I don't need an apology, Zach, I said, my voice steady. I've moved on. I've built something for myself, something that has nothing to do with you or mom or dad. I'm happy. That's all that matters to me. He nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. I get that. I do. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, truly. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to hear it from me. The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. For a moment, I let myself consider them, let myself feel the weight of what he was saying. But forgiveness wasn't something I could just hand out, not after everything. I appreciate that, Zach, I said finally, my tone distant but calm. But I think it's best if we both move on. We're different people now, living different lives. He nodded slowly, the realization settling over him. I understand. I wish things had been different. So do I replied, letting a hint of softness slip into my voice. But we can't change the past. All we can do is learn from it. He looked at me, really looked at me, as if he was seeing me for the first time. There was a sadness in his eyes, a resignation that made him seem smaller, less certain. With a final nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I watched him go, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over me. As the night continued, I found myself surrounded by people who admired my work, people who saw me as an artist, as someone with a voice and a vision. For the first time, I felt truly free, untethered from the expectations and obligations that had weighed me down for so long. When I returned home that night, I felt lighter, like a chapter of my life had finally closed. I'd faced my past, confronted the people who had hurt me, and emerged on the other side stronger and more certain of who I was. The ghosts of resentment and betrayal had faded, replaced by a quiet peace, a sense of self that couldn't be shaken. In the days that followed, I threw myself back into my art, exploring new ideas, new themes, pushing myself in ways I hadn't dared before. I didn't need my family's approval or their apologies to know my worth. I'd found it within myself, and that was something no one could ever take away. I'd built my own life, carved my own path, and for the first time, I knew that I didn't owe anyone anything. This was my story, and I was finally free to live it on my own terms. The call came late one night, just as I was locking up my studio. I stared at my phone, the familiar number flashing on the screen, filling me with a sense of foreboding. It was Mom. She rarely called, and whenever she did, it was usually because something was wrong. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity, and maybe a lingering sense of obligation, got the best of me. I took a deep breath and answered. "Hello." "Nora," she said, her voice trembling. It's your father. He's not well. It's serious this time. The doctors say it might be too late." Her words hung in the air, heavy and thick. I felt my heart drop, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within me. I hadn't seen my father since I left all those years ago. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the bitterness, he was still my dad. The news hit me harder than I'd expected. "When did this happen?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "It's been going on for a while," she admitted, a hint of guilt in her voice. "But he didn't want you to know. He was too proud. And, well, things have been difficult. With the restaurant gone. And with Zach. Of course, it always came back to Zach. Even now, in the midst of this crisis, he was still at the center. I could hear it in her voice, the unspoken expectation that I would step in, just like I always had. But this time was different. I wasn't that girl anymore, the one who would sacrifice everything for the sake of the family. "What are you asking me to do, Mom?" I said, bracing myself. She hesitated, her silence speaking volumes. "We need help, Nora. We don't have the money to pay for all the treatments. And Zach, he's not in a good place either. He's been trying to take care of your father, but he's overwhelmed. We thought that maybe you could come back just for a little while. Help us get through this." I clenched my jaw, feeling the familiar anger rise within me. They'd kept me in the dark about my father's illness, kept me out of their lives, and now, when things were falling apart, they expected me to pick up the pieces. Again. "Mom, I've built a life here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I have my own responsibilities, my own commitments. I can't just drop everything and come running every time you need something." Her silence on the other end of the line was like a weight pressing down on me, pulling at something deep within me that I thought I'd buried. "I know, Nora," she whispered finally. "I know we haven't been fair to you. But please, just this once, we need you. Your father needs you." I didn't answer right away. I felt torn, a part of me wanting to rush to their side, to be the daughter they were asking for. But another part of me, the part that had fought so hard to break free, resisted. I'd spent years rebuilding myself, carving out a life that was finally mine. Going back now, even for a short time, felt like stepping into a trap. But this was my father. No matter how much I resented him for his choices, for his favoritism toward Zach, he was still family. And no matter how much I tried to move on, that connection still held power over me. "Fine," I said finally, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "I'll come, but just for a few days." I could hear the relief in her voice, and it made me feel both comforted and resentful. "Thank you, Nora. Thank you." The drive back felt surreal, like stepping into a memory I'd tried to forget. The town hadn't changed much, the streets still familiar even after all this time. As I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house, I felt a strange mix of emotions: nostalgia, sadness, and a deep, simmering anger that had never quite gone away. Mom greeted me at the door, her face lined with worry and exhaustion. She looked older than I remembered, her shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. "Nora," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt both warm and heavy. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She led me into the living room, where my father sat in his old recliner, looking frail and worn. The sight of him, so diminished from the man I'd once known, stirred something in me, an old pain, a sadness that I hadn't expected to feel. He looked up as I entered, his eyes flickering with a mixture of surprise and something else. "Nora," he said, his voice raspy. "You came." "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm here." We sat in uncomfortable silence, the weight of years of unspoken words filling the room. I could see the regret in his eyes, but I wasn't ready to let go of the resentment that had fueled me for so long. I'd built a life without him, without any of them, and I wasn't about to let myself fall back into old patterns. Over the next few days, I helped as much as I could, taking care of things around the house, running errands, making sure my father was comfortable. Zach was nowhere to be found most of the time, off somewhere avoiding responsibility as usual. It was painfully familiar, and every time I thought about it, I felt the old anger bubbling up. One afternoon, I found Zach in the garage, leaning against the wall with a cigarette in hand, looking worn and defeated. He glanced up as I entered, his expression guarded. "So, you're really back, huh?" he said, his tone a mixture of bitterness and relief. "For now," I replied, crossing my arms. "I'm here for Dad, not for you." He took a long drag, exhaling the smoke in a slow, deliberate breath. "Figures. You always were the responsible one, the good one, the one who did everything right." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Funny, coming from you. You're the one they always protected, the one they'd sacrifice anything for. And look where it got us." He looked away, his face shadowed with guilt. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent years trying to make it right?" "Trying?" I shot back, my voice sharp. "You've done nothing but take and take, leaving me to clean up the mess. And even now, you expect me to do it again." He didn't respond, his silence speaking louder than words. I felt the anger boiling over, years of resentment spilling out in a rush. "You have no idea what I gave up, what I sacrificed so that you could have everything handed to you. And all you ever did was throw it away." He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with something that looked like remorse. "I know, Nora. I know I messed up. And I'm sorry. But I don't know how to fix it." I shook my head, the bitterness in my chest giving way to something softer, a sadness I hadn't realized I'd been holding on to. "Maybe you can't. Maybe some things can't be fixed." We stood there in silence, the weight of the past hanging heavy between us. I could see the regret in his eyes, the recognition of everything he'd taken for granted. But it wasn't enough. An apology wouldn't change the years I'd spent sacrificing for him, the dreams I'd lost, the life I'd had to rebuild on my own. That night, as I sat by my father's bedside, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I'd come back, done what I could, but I knew now that I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for a family that would never truly understand the weight of what I'd given up. I'd come to say goodbye, to close this chapter, and to finally let go of the anger and pain that had defined so much of my life. When I left the next morning, my parents and Zach watched me from the porch, their faces a mixture of sadness and resignation. I felt a pang of guilt, but I knew this was the right choice. I had my own life, my own dreams, and I wasn't going to let anyone take them away from me again. As I drove away, the town faded into the distance, and I felt a sense of freedom wash over me. I'd come back to face my past, to confront the people who had hurt me, and I'd found the strength to walk away. This time, I knew I wasn't running. I was choosing myself, choosing the life I'd fought so hard to build. And for the first time, I felt truly at peace. When I got back to the city, I felt something had shifted inside me. It was like I'd finally put down a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying all these years. The bitterness, the anger, they were still there, like faint scars that hadn't completely healed. But they didn't hurt the same way anymore. I'd confronted my family, faced the parts of myself I'd hidden away, and walked away knowing that I owed them nothing. I was free. Back in my studio, I felt a surge of inspiration, as though something inside me had been unlocked. I spent hours painting, channeling everything I'd experienced into each stroke. I painted images of dark forests, tangled with roots and shadows, places people could lose themselves in and never find their way out. But in the center of each piece, I painted a light, a small, unwavering flame that refused to be snuffed out. That light was mine, a reminder of the resilience I'd found within myself, of the strength that had carried me through all the years of struggle. The weeks passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. I spent my days working on new projects, collaborating with artists who understood me in ways my family never had. The gallery continued to support my work, and word spread about my art, drawing in people from all over. It felt like everything I'd sacrificed, every struggle I'd endured, had led me to this point. I was exactly where I was meant to be. One evening, I received an invitation to participate in a major exhibition, a showcase featuring artists who had used their work to process personal trauma and transformation. It was an opportunity one couldn't turn down, a chance to tell my story in a way that reached beyond words. I decided to submit a series called Unbound, each painting a different chapter of my journey, from the dark moments of sacrifice to the bright, freeing realization that I was no longer tied down. As I prepared for the exhibition, I felt a calm settle over me. The anger and resentment that had once consumed me had transformed into something softer, something more meaningful. I didn't feel the need to prove myself to my family anymore. I'd found my worth, my voice, and it was louder and more powerful than any of their opinions. On the night of the exhibition, I stood by my work, watching as people moved from one painting to the next, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: sadness, empathy, hope. Some people lingered, gazing at the paintings with a quiet intensity, and I could see that they understood. They could feel the journey, the pain, the strength it had taken to break free. A woman approached me, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for this," she said, her voice trembling. I've I've been through something similar. Your work, it makes me feel like I'm not alone." Her words touched something deep within me, a part of myself that had always yearned to be seen, to be understood. "You're not alone," I told her gently. "We all have our own battles, our own journeys, but we come out stronger on the other side." As the evening went on, I spoke to others who shared similar stories, people who had broken free from toxic relationships, from families that had tried to define them. Each conversation felt like a piece of healing, not just for them, but for me as well. I realized that, in sharing my story, I was helping others find their own strength, their own light in the darkness. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin, I noticed a familiar face standing at the edge of the room. It was Zach. I hadn't seen him since I'd left my parents' house, and seeing him here, in my world, felt strange, like a ghost from a past life. He approached slowly, his gaze moving over each painting, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked at me, there was a softness in his eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I didn't expect you to come," I said, keeping my tone neutral. He nodded, shifting awkwardly. "I didn't think I would, either. But I wanted to see it, to see what you've created." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize just how much I'd hurt you. How much all of us did. Looking at this, I see it now. And I'm sorry, Nora, for everything." I studied him, searching his face for any hint of insincerity. But all I saw was regret, a sadness that seemed to weigh him down. Part of me wanted to hold on to the anger, to remind him of everything he'd taken from me. But another part of me, the part that had fought so hard to heal, didn't want to carry that burden anymore. "I appreciate that, Zach," I said quietly. "But I didn't do this for you. I did this for me. I needed to let go of the past, to find peace. And I have." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing my words. "I understand. I just, I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. I always have been, even if I never showed it." Hearing those words felt strange, like hearing a song from a lifetime ago. I didn't need his pride or his approval, but it still felt like a small, unexpected closure, a door gently closing on a painful chapter. As he turned to leave, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I knew this was the last time I'd see him, the last time I'd let any part of my past hold sway over me. I'd made peace with my family, with the choices they'd made, and I was finally free to live my life on my own terms. The weeks following the exhibition were filled with a new sense of purpose. My work continued to gain recognition, and I was offered opportunities to teach, to share my story with others who had experienced similar struggles. I threw myself into these projects, finding joy in helping others discover their own paths to healing. One evening, as I sat in my studio surrounded by my work, I felt a deep sense of contentment settle over me. I no longer felt the need to prove myself to anyone. I was enough, just as I was, and that realization filled me with a quiet, unshakable strength. Looking back on everything I'd been through, I felt nothing but gratitude. Every hardship, every sacrifice, every moment of pain had led me to this point. I'd built a life of my own, a life filled with meaning and purpose, and I knew that no matter what came next, I would face it with the same strength and resilience that had carried me this far. For the first time in my life, I felt whole, complete in a way I never thought possible. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined me. They were simply part of my story, a testament to the journey I'd taken, the battles I'd fought, and the person I'd become. As I looked at the latest canvas on my easel, a painting of a woman standing at the edge of a vast, open field, her face turned toward the rising sun, I felt a surge of hope for the future. This was my story, and it was only just beginning.